there is a person in your life right now who does not deserve access to you. You already know who it is. You have known for longer than you have been willing to admit. The signs were there before you had the language for them. The feeling was there before you had the evidence. And somewhere between the feeling and the evidence, you talked yourself out of acting on what you already knew. This video is about why you did that. And why Machiavelli would tell you that the delay, not the betrayal itself, is the thing that cost you most. Because the betrayal happened once, the delay in responding to it happened every single day afterward. There is a version of strength that most people never develop. Not the strength to confront. Not the strength to argue, to demand accountability, to explain why the relationship has failed. The strength to simply stop. To remove access. To close the door without a speech. To cut them off and say absolutely nothing. This is harder than it sounds. Because the silence that follows a removal is not the comfortable silence of indifference. It is the active silence of a person who has made a decision and refuses to negotiate it. Who has assessed the situation with clear eyes and determined that the relationship has no further claim on their time, their energy, or their loyalty. Machiavelli wrote in The Prince that wounds should be inflicted all at once so that their bitterness being tasted less they offend less. He was writing about political decisions. But the principle extends directly into personal life. The person who removes someone partially, gradually, apologetically, who cuts them off and then explains, who withdraws and then re-engages, who closes the door and then holds it slightly open, has not cut them off at all. They have simply relocated the relationship into a longer, more painful version of what it already was. Cut them off. Say nothing. Completely. Once. Part 1. Why you have not done it yet. Let us begin with the question that matters most. You already know this person should not have access to you. You have known for some time. So why have you not acted on that knowledge? The answers are almost always one of 5 things. The first is the sunk cost. The relationship has history. Years, in some cases. Shared experiences. Moments that were genuinely good before the dynamic revealed itself, and the mind resists discarding something it has invested in, regardless of whether continuing the investment makes rational sense. Behavioral economists call this the sunk cost fallacy. Machiavelli called it the primary reason princes kept advisors long after those advisors had stopped serving the prince and started serving themselves. The history of the investment is not a reason to continue it. It is simply a record of what has already been spent. The second is the fear of their reaction. You know how they will respond when you remove access. The anger, the accusations, the campaign to recast your withdrawal as the problem rather than the behavior that caused it. The performance of victimhood. The mutual contacts who will be recruited to carry messages back and forth. You have already run the scenario in your mind dozens of times. And each time, the anticipated discomfort of their reaction has been enough to delay the decision. Machiavelli addressed this directly. He wrote that men will avenge slight offenses but cannot avenge severe ones. The prince who is feared enough to be truly dangerous will not be tested by petty retaliation. What this means practically is that the decisive removal, complete, silent, unambiguous, is actually less dangerous than the partial withdrawal. The partial withdrawal invites negotiation, lobbying, and pressure. The complete removal leaves nothing to negotiate with. The third is the guilt. This person has invested in you in some way. Done things for you. Been present at important moments. And the guilt of removing access feels like a betrayal of those investments. Like you are declaring that none of it mattered. This confusion between gratitude and obligation is one of the most common traps in personal relationships. You can be genuinely grateful for what someone gave you in the past while also recognizing that the present version of the relationship is extracting more than it is contributing. These two things are not in conflict. Gratitude does not require you to continue providing access to someone who is no longer serving your life or your integrity. The fourth is the hope that it will change. There has been a conversation. maybe several. Promises were made. Improvements appeared briefly before the pattern reasserted itself. And part of you still believes that the right words, the right circumstances, the right version of the conversation might produce a different outcome. Machiavelli was precise about this. He wrote that a man who changes his behavior only under pressure will revert when the pressure is removed. The change is not genuine. It is a strategic adjustment to preserve access. When the access is no longer under threat, the original behavior returns. You are not dealing with a person who does not understand what they are doing. You are dealing with a person who understands it perfectly and adjusts only when the cost of not adjusting becomes too immediate to ignore. The fifth is the identity cost. Some relationships have become so embedded in how you understand yourself that removing them requires a reorganization of your own self-concept. You have been this person's friend for so long that not being their friend feels like losing part of who you are. The relationship is not just external. It has structural weight inside your own identity. This is the most sophisticated trap of all, and the most important one to name, because a relationship that has become load-bearing in your identity has given the other person leverage that goes far beyond ordinary social access. They can influence your decisions, your self-assessment, and your behavior simply by being present in your conception of who you are. The removal is not just relational. It is reconstructive. And that reconstruction, while uncomfortable, is precisely what freedom from the dynamic requires. Part 2. Why the explanation makes it worse. When most people finally decide to remove someone from their life, they do it with an explanation. A final conversation. A message outlining what went wrong and why the relationship cannot continue. A detailed account of the specific behaviors that led to this decision. I want to explain precisely why this is a mistake. The explanation assumes that the problem in the relationship is a lack of understanding, that if this person simply understood the impact of their behavior, understood why you are making this decision, understood the specific grievances, they would accept the removal as reasonable and the relationship would end cleanly. This assumption is almost always wrong. The person whose behavior caused the removal already knows what they did. Not necessarily with the same language you would use. Not necessarily with the same assessment of its severity. But the behavior was not accidental. It was not a misunderstanding that a conversation can resolve. It was a pattern, deliberate or habitual, that continued long after its effect on you was visible. When you give this person an explanation, you do not give them closure. You give them a negotiating document. Every point you raise becomes a point they can counter, reframe, minimize, or redirect. Every grievance you articulate becomes an opportunity for them to explain why your reading of the situation is incomplete, unfair, or emotionally distorted. The conversation you intended as a conclusion becomes the beginning of a new argument about who is right. Machiavelli observed that a prince who explains his decisions to the people he governs has made his decision contingent on their approval. And a decision that is contingent on approval can always be appealed. The prince who decides and does not explain has made a decision that cannot be appealed because there is no articulated position to argue against. The same principle applies here. The removal explained is a removal that can be contested. The removal that simply happens, the silence that follows the withdrawal of access, is not a position. It is a fact, and facts are significantly harder to argue with than positions. There is a deeper reason the explanation makes it worse. It tells the other person that you still care enough about their understanding to invest time and emotional energy in producing it. The explanation is a form of engagement. An engagement with a dynamic you are trying to leave is the opposite of leaving. The silent removal says something the explanation cannot say. It says that this relationship no longer has a claim on your time, your words, your emotional labor, or your need to be understood, that the accounting is closed. That you have made a decision from a position complete enough that it requires no external validation. That is the message the silent removal sends. And it is the only message that the dynamic you are leaving cannot find a way to contest. Part 3. What the silence communicates. The silence after a removal communicates something that most people spend years trying to communicate through words and never successfully transmit. It communicates that you have made a decision from a position of sufficient clarity and strength that you do not require the other person's agreement with it. That your assessment of the situation is complete. That you are not performing the removal for their benefit or for the benefit of any audience. That you have simply determined what is true and acted accordingly. This is a fundamentally different communication than the one most people attempt. Most people, when they remove someone from their life, are still partly trying to make the other person understand. Still partly hoping for acknowledgement. Still partly seeking the validation of the other person agreeing that yes, this makes sense, yes, I understand why you are doing this, yes, you are right to leave. The removal is real. But it is entangled with the need for the other person's recognition of its legitimacy. The silent removal has separated from that need entirely. And that separation is visible. To the person being removed. To anyone observing. It reads as the behavior of someone who is genuinely done, not performing being done, not hoping to be talked back from done, but actually done. The conversation is already over in your mind. The silence is simply the external expression of an internal conclusion that was already reached. Machiavelli wrote that the prince's greatest source of strength was the appearance of completeness. The prince who seemed uncertain was a prince who invited challenges. The prince who seemed settled in his decisions, not rigid, but settled, communicated an authority that made challenges less likely and less effective when they did occur. The silent removal is the most complete version of this principle in personal life. There is no uncertainty in it. No door left open. No message asking whether they received your previous message. No mutual contact used as an intermediary. Just the withdrawal of access and the silence that follows. That silence will be interpreted by the other person in a way that tells you something important about them. Some people will respect it immediately. They will understand, perhaps reluctantly, that something genuine has shifted and that the removal is real. Others will escalate. Messages, attempts to reach you through others, the recruitment of shared social networks to carry their response. This escalation is information. It shows you exactly how the other person relates to a boundary they cannot negotiate. Either way, the silence was the right choice. Because it produced clarity. And clarity, Machiavelli argued, was always worth the short-term discomfort of the path that produced it. Part 4. The Machiavellian Framework for Removal. Machiavelli did not write about personal betrayal directly. He wrote about politics, about princes, about the management of power in states. But the framework he developed maps onto personal relationships with a precision that is sometimes uncomfortable to acknowledge. He wrote that there are two types of people in a prince's life. Those whose fortunes are tied to the prince's fortune, who rise when the prince rises and fall when the prince falls, and those whose fortunes are independent of the prince, who maintain their position regardless of how the prince fares, and who therefore have no structural incentive to serve the prince's interests. In personal terms, this distinction is equally sharp. There are people in your life whose well-being is genuinely connected to yours. Who benefit when you succeed, who are diminished when you struggle, who have a real stake in your flourishing. And there are people who are present in your life for entirely different reasons: access, status, convenience, the extraction of resources, whose connection to you is transactional in ways that are invisible on the surface. Machiavelli's prince was expected to identify which category each person belonged to. Not based on what they said about themselves or about their loyalty. Based on observable behavior over time. What did they do when the prince was vulnerable? What did they do when another more powerful actor appeared? What did they do with information that could either help the prince or help themselves? The same framework applies to your relationships. Not in a paranoid way. Not with the assumption that everyone is working against you. But with the clear-eyed willingness to observe what people actually do when the observation produces information you need. The person who should be cut off has usually already answered the Machiavellian question. They have shown, through repeated observable behavior, that their presence in your life is organized around what they extract from it rather than what they contribute to it. They have shown you how they use information about your vulnerabilities. They have shown you what they do when you are at your lowest and most in need of genuine support. They have shown you what they do when an opportunity to benefit themselves at your expense presents itself. You have seen all of this. The question is not whether the evidence exists. The question is whether you are willing to act on it. Machiavelli wrote that the prince who delays in dealing with a known threat does not preserve peace. He simply transfers the cost of the conflict into the future while allowing it to compound. The small removal that should have happened a year ago is now a larger, more complicated removal because the person has had a year to deepen their access, their information, and their structural presence in your life. The delay is not neutral. Every day you do not act on what you already know is a day that makes the eventual action more costly. Part 5. How to do it. The mechanics are simpler than the psychology makes them feel. You stop responding. Not with an explanation of why you are stopping. Not with a message that sets expectations for reduced contact. You simply stop. The last exchange ends and the next one never begins. You reduce access. Gradually or immediately depending on the depth of the entanglement. Social media, shared spaces, mutual contacts. Not dramatically, drama is another form of engagement. Simply and practically. You do not perform the removal, you execute it. You do not recruit allies. The temptation to tell mutual contacts about the removal, to ensure that the social narrative around it is accurate, to protect your reputation with people who know both of you, is almost always a mistake. It extends the dynamic into the shared social environment. It makes the removal a social event rather than a personal decision. And it almost always creates more complexity than it resolves. You do not monitor them. The checking of their social media, the asking of mutual contacts how they seem, the attention to whether they are aware of the removal and how they are reacting, all of this is a form of continued engagement. The removal is not complete while you are still watching. You do not respond to their attempts to re-engage. The message that arrives after the removal, casual, as if nothing has changed, or urgent, as if something critical has occurred, is a test of the removal's completeness. Responding to it restores the access you have just removed. Not responding confirms the decision you have already made. Machiavelli wrote that the prince who must be consistent above all else in his decisive actions. Inconsistency in removal is worse than no removal at all. Because it teaches the other person that sufficient pressure will produce re-engagement. And a person who has learned that lesson will apply that pressure every time. The silence is not cruelty. It is clarity. It is the most honest communication available in a dynamic where words have repeatedly proven insufficient or easily manipulated. It says what needs to be said with more precision than any conversation could achieve. And over time, not immediately, but over time, the silence becomes comfortable. The space that was occupied by the dynamic fills with other things. Better things. People and experiences and possibilities that were crowded out by the maintenance costs of a relationship that was extracting more than it was contributing. This is what Machiavelli meant when he wrote that the prince must sometimes sacrifice what is comfortable in the present for what is necessary in the future. The removal is uncomfortable. The silence is uncomfortable. The reconstruction of the space that person occupied is uncomfortable. And on the other side of all of that discomfort is something that looks, in retrospect, like the most obvious decision you ever delayed making. There is a person you thought of at the beginning of this video. The one you have been carrying longer than was ever necessary. The one whose access to you has been costing you things you cannot fully account for but can feel. The one you have had the conversation with, or imagined having it, 100 times. The one whose removal you have been delaying for one of the 5 reasons we named at the beginning. Sunk cost. Fear of reaction. Guilt. Hope that it will change. Identity cost. None of those 5 things are reasons. They are feelings, and feelings, as Machiavelli understood with cold precision, are information about your current state. They are not instructions about what to do. The instruction comes from the observable evidence. The pattern of behavior over time. The question of what this person does when you are vulnerable, when an opportunity appears, when their interests and yours are not aligned. The answer to that question, the one you already have, is the instruction. Cut them off. Say nothing. Not because silence is superior to honesty, because in this specific dynamic, with this specific person, the conversation that should produce resolution has already been tried, has already failed, and has already revealed that words are not the mechanism through which this situation will be resolved. The resolution is the removal. Complete. Silent. Once. And then the work of filling the space with things that are actually worth the room. If this video gave you language for something you already knew, that is what this channel is for. Not to tell you things you have never considered. To give precise language to things you have already felt but could not fully articulate. Subscribe. Because the next video will do the same thing. And if there is someone in your life this video described, you already know what to do.